Okay, we are live. My guest, John Allore's sister, Theresa, was a student at Champlain College when she disappeared without a trace on November 3rd, 1978. Theresa's body was discovered 5 months later in a creek nearby. After the police closed Theresa's case, declaring it a drug overdose, John set out on a decades-long search to unravel the mystery surrounding Theresa's death. His book, Wish You Were Here, is published by Vintage Canada division of Penguin Random House and is now out in paperback. And it details both his search for answers and his surprising discoveries. Welcome, John Allore.
Thank you, Roberta.
So, um, can you tell me a little bit about your sister, Theresa?
Yeah. So she was 19 when she disappeared. I was 13, 14. She was really kind of a child of the 70s, experimenting and finding her way. Very adventurous. So anything from, at a time when it was considered extremely risky to like have a road bike and cycle everywhere. I think it's still risky, but she did that, skydive, hiking, a very crunchy kind of thing, a little pot, sure, um, but was really a young child of the late 1970s who, after a year out of school, decided to come back and apply herself and really wanted to get a university education and wound up at Champlain College.
And and can you talk a little bit about her disappearance and what and how she was found and what clues were left?
Sure. So Theresa went missing from college about 6 weeks after her arrival in the fall of 1978. And at that time, it seemed relatively normal. She was seen by friends at lunch on campus with every intention of returning to her dorm residence, which was about 10 kilometers away that evening. She was supposed to, that Friday night, get together with some girlfriends and listen to Cat Stevens and Fleetwood Mac and Genesis. And she didn't show up. She didn't show up. And so a lot of people, because we were from Montreal, had kind of assumed, well, she just decided to go back to Montreal for the weekend. But when she didn't show up by midweek, a bunch of students got together and told my brother, who then phoned my parents, and this sort of kind of triggered an investigation into where she was and what could have possibly happened. The theories started innocent enough, sort of like, well, maybe she went back to see her boyfriend in Calgary and then they increasingly got absurd to, maybe she's pregnant and has gone to a monastery, to maybe she's run away to Florida. Well, there's no reason for her to have been in Florida, to maybe she's ashamed because she's really a secret closeted lesbian, although I don't know what's wrong with that.
That was so strange. Yeah, and the other thing was, which was very popular, was one of the other ideas was that she had joined a cult, which was very popular. She had a book about Zen Buddhism. So they were
yeah, exactly. Yeah. The Mooney cult was going on at the same time. The Jim Jones thing kind of fell right around the whole time in Jonestown and all of that. So yes, cultism, finding yourself in California or in upstate Vermont or New Hampshire was not unusual. It wasn't improbable, but increasingly school authorities and police authorities tended to hatch onto these ideas. And I'll cut to the chase and sort of say victim blaming, obviously, rather than looking at what was probably more probable was that she was the victim of a crime of malfeasance, because it was not unknown. Several women had been sexually assaulted on campus prior to her disappearance. Several women in the area had wound up dead. Young women, 19-year-old, found shot in June 1978 in the outskirts. 10-year-old girl, went missing and was found on the outskirts of where she was found. The year prior, an obvious murder of a woman, a 24-year-old named Louise Camera, found asphyxiated and quite obviously physically assaulted, rape. So it wasn't really adding up, and yet the authorities were ignoring these options and focusing more on, well, it's her fault. She's obviously gone and done something to herself.
And you talk about in this book, the green, you just mentioned, I'm going to circle back to some of those things in a minute, but the green parka man, and basically this sounds like a serial rapist going on campus, and the police's reaction and the college's reaction was just to kind of ignore it. And it's so hard in this time to imagine that. But can you talk a little bit about the attitudes towards rape and the police's attitudes towards rape?
Well, I don't think they really understood the true nature of sexual assault. I mean, I'll also cut ahead and say, Theresa, as you said, Theresa was found 5.5 months later, kind of in a drainage ditch next to a cornfield, face down in her bra and underwear. And the police's reaction to this was, well, that doesn't mean anything. The underwear wasn't tampered with. It wasn't ripped or torn. So that's not rape. It's just like, if you ask any woman what that would lead your imagination, where it would lead to go, they would say, well, maybe it's not vaginal rape, but it's definitely signs of a sexual assault. There are other options here involving sexual assault. So it was a very closed-mindedness. I mean, Green Parka Man happened in the months prior, in January and February on campus, and they just ignored women who were crying out, saying, "Look, this is going on." And when it finally made the campus papers, as it would, as student newspapers, women were writing about it there. It wasn't until it hit the local papers that they acknowledged the problem. And of course, what was their reaction? Well, they replaced the chief. They fired the local police chief and they brought in a new guy. Was the way. But whether they really confronted the problem, I would argue with that. I think they brought a new guy in and sort of said, hey, you need to get this under wraps and control this situation. And because we really don't want it in, this is a small college town, and this kind of chatter about rape on campus affects property values, and please do not, get it under wraps, is really what they were saying.
So how does Theresa's body being found in her bra and underwear equal a drug in a creek equal a drug overdose?
Well, right. Once the body was found, the explanations got even more absurd. Drug overdose, suicide, allergic reaction, and what I still don't understand this. Theresa's body underwent a full toxicological report at the time and found no presence of drugs. They retested that evidence in the 2000s with modern techniques, no drugs, and further no alcohol with modern testing. And yet still at the time, you had the lead investigator, who was still active, going on national Canadian television and saying, I'm still convinced of a drug overdose. Now, when I put this to modern investigators, they said, they'd never heard of a case where an investigator would go against the evidence, would say, in spite of the toxicological evidence, I'm still insisting on a drug overdose. It's unheard of.
And it was really shocking to read was also the Champlain College's reaction to this. They were still charging your parents for room and board after her disappearance, and they just seemed completely. What do you think that? What do you think that is about?
I think that's about, again, town and gown relationships. I mean, to this day, in the United States, we have something, quite famous called the Cleary Act, based on the I think it's Jane Cleary, who was sexually assaulted at Lehigh University, and from this we got the Cleary Act, which said that now colleges and universities need to disclose their sexual assaults on campus. Well, all of that is very fine and good, but there's no enforcing mechanism behind it. So you can have something like the Cleary Act, but if it has no teeth and no one is really compelled to report, it really means nothing. And I say that to try to relate it to an American audience. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We've had a long history of this problem on campus, with cases with them denying sexual assaults. The Eve Carson case here is most recently very famous, where they tried to hide this. The school valedictorian was abducted and shot, shotgun murder, and so I think it's a typical reaction of a college to deflect, to victim blame, to do everything in their power to call attention away from the campus responsibility and blame it on the person who was offended.
Because I just finished covering the trial of about my former college alma mater, Sarah Lawrence, where they had a cult leader, Larry Ray. You know the case, living on campus. Yes. And I attended every day of that trial, and the college hasn't changed their tune at all. They still say they had no idea. It's just impossible knowing that. There's one thing about that college that never changes, which is very small. Everybody knows each other's business. And also the evidence that was presented in that case, letters written to the dean, they knew, and now they're just blaming the alumnus that exposed the story. It's crazy. So I would like to say that things have changed since the 70s, but it just seems like protect the college's reputation at all costs. It still goes on. So speaking of Chapel Hill, so in 2001, cops came to your Chapel Hill home investigating a murder. What was that about, and why did that get you interested in reinvestigating or investigating Theresa's murder?
Well, it's very strange. I mean, you could make the case that I kind of ran away from Canada and all of my past problems. That's not all of it, but certainly, I have not lived in Canada for 35 years. I kind of was a nomad for a while, between New York and Los Angeles, and eventually settling down in Carborough, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And within weeks of purchasing our first home with my then wife, Elizabeth, at the time, we had a knock on our door, and the local police said the former owner's son is the lead suspect in a missing persons investigation. We'd like to check, your property for a body. And so, for me, that was really like the stars aligning and kicking me in the ass and saying, well, wait a minute. Life is trying to tell you something here. You can run away from your problems, but when they come around and the fates say, look, we want to check your property for a body, something is trying to tell you here. So, I won't go too much into the case of Debbie Key, except that she's still missing. Her body was never found. They They checked the property. I mean, we had the SBI there and the luminol in the crawl space and all of that. Long and short of it is they were able to determine that they thought that a body had been placed under the home because they brought in sniffer dogs, but it had not been there for long. And my feeling, to this day was I couldn't figure out, why these small town cops were being so diligent in their work, and I couldn't get the same. I couldn't get any attention from the Quebec police, any interest. I mean, they were still saying drug overdose, right? It was over 20 years later, and they were still hanging on to a theory that was not evidence based. And so I would say that event kind of catapulted me into sort of renewed interest in my sister's case.
And so you looked at a lot of similar cases, and two along one road, which you just mentioned. I'm sorry, Manon Dubé. I have a habit of messing up names, and Louise Camarade.
Yes.
Why do you think? And Dubé was 10 years old. Why do you think a 10-year-old's disappearance and two adult women's were connected? Or do you think that doesn't matter? Or just what was similar about those two?
I think it could matter. The sort of standard answer about the 10-year-old Manon Dubé is it could not have been an attempted murder sex crime because she was 10. Number one, because she was found fully clothed in her snowsuit. Number two, to which I again say, have you never heard of an oral sexual assault? Have you never heard of a hand job? Excuse me for being crass, but there are other avenues here to explore, and the fact that and the other glaring one for me was I was able to find the coroner's report. And the first thing that he mentions is possible sexual assault. This in spite of the snowsuit and the fully clothing. It's where his imagination went as well. So, I mean, that's my main reason for looking at them. And then the geographic profile, as you say, I mean, she lived and went to school and was found in the same geographic area where Theresa was found and when Louise Cameron was found, and within about a 19-month frame of time. And then the third thing, of course, was were those murders, those other two murders or death, were they solved? No, they were not solved. So it's like, okay, well, what is the harm in looking at them in relation to each other? If you've obviously not cracked them, where is there the harm in exploring that? And the police were adamant that they did not want to look at the files in relation to each other. Why?
And you also had a feeling of a very small town. There's like three characters that all went to high school with each other in this book. So, and they're telling each other different things. So this investigator is telling his high school friend it's a murder, but he's telling the public and you that it's a drug overdose. So
it's very bizarre. I mean, we sort of left that to your imagination in the book. I think what you're bringing up is the fact that I confronted a professor, Jerry Cutting, who just kind of disclosed that he knew the lead investigator, Roch Gaudreau, from high school. And Roch is saying it's a drug overdose, but he's telling Jerry, oh no, we always thought that was a murder. And what that means, I don't know. Did he mishear it? We sort of leave that to the reader's imagination, because at a certain point, I can't explain everything, but it certainly is bizarre. It certainly is very bizarre. And I do think it's a product of small towns where everybody knows each other, where you don't want to overturn too many rocks, because you're going to run into somebody's brother or cousin or something, or business partner, and it's just going to become very, very messy.
If you're just tuning in, You're listening to best-selling true crime author John Allore talking about his book, Wish You Were Here, now published in paperback by Vintage Books, a subsidiary of Penguin Random House Canada. So you identify a suspect at the end of your book. Why do you think why do you think he's a good suspect, and why do you think he may be responsible for your sister's murder?
So I'd say in the time since we wrote the book, I no longer think he's the best suspect, but I can tell you why we did consider him as a good suspect and why the police still consider him as a good suspect. Number one, he was from the area, and he had a history of sexually assaulting women in a manner that was described by the campus rapist, the green parka man. He fit the description: bowl cut, short, equally adept in French and English, all of this. He fit the MO. So number one. Number two, he did go on to become a murderer. Luc Gregoire eventually ended up in Calgary, Alberta, where he abducted and murdered a 7-Eleven clerk. And in the manner of the abduction and the manner of the body disposal pretty much fit the MOs of Louise Cameron, Manon Dubé, and Theresa Allore. There were similarities there. So we felt that was worth exploring. I mean, the third thing is we went to a criminologist who had actually interviewed Luc Gregoire, and his ultimate conclusion was it's improbable that Luc Gregoire was not the perpetrator of these crimes. So it's not really, it's sort of a roundabout probability, right? It's a backdoor probability. But it was the best we had going into it. We never said that Luc Gregoire was the guy. We always said that this was pretty close, and you should investigate it based on what we know.
Mm. And one of the most, and Gregoire was also given the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So essentially what we would consider a sociopath or a psychopath. You wrote him a letter, and he wrote you a letter back, and you sent his response to criminal psychologists. And I thought their analysis was so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what they got from his letter?
Yeah, sure. So I sent it to, I believe it's John Douglas, who worked on the Unabomber case, since he had a lot of experience with ciphers and handwriting analysis, and somebody made an introduction, so I sent it to him and to a couple of other people to just see what they thought of this letter, and they just felt that it was a little too assured. It was, I'd sent similar. Well, I had sent identical letters to Quebec murderers who I knew weren't responsible for Theresa's murder. And one of them didn't write back. Good response. One of them wrote back a very convincing letter that he was not responsible for these murders. It was just, I don't want to go into too much. It was convincing. Luc's response was not convincing. He avoided using I and anything that personalized it. He was a little too flip in his response. He was like, "No way," and "I'm really sorry. Hope you catch that guy." It was.
I feel your pain.
I feel your pain. Do you
I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah. I feel your pain. Or on the other side, I bet you do. You were there. It was very,
right.
It was very odd. It was very odd. I would have. Listen, I'm not a guy who wants to get too close to these people. Clifford Olson once contacted me, and I was strongly advised not to get back to him. He's a Canadian serial killer, which I never did. I was advised he'll get inside your head. With Luc, I was prepared to go a little further in the correspondence. But then he died of they say in prison of a heart attack in 2015.
Hmm. And actually, I'm going to skip forward. Speaking of not wanting to get too close or not wanting to get involved, you talk about going to Crime Con in this book.
I'm glad you brought it up.
And your description of Crime Con truly horrified me. I mean, just the commercialization of murder and kind of making it like this, you can get handcuffed and you can get, I mean, some of it you can say, okay, it's a gimmick, but, I just had a really hard time with just the whole thing of it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I would say this about it. I can't deny that the book that was written is true crime. And if somebody says to me, well, I don't like true crime, I very easily make a persuasive argument for why it's not true crime and it's memoir. So I can swim in those waters. I can throw down with that crowd. Fine. Do I think it's exploitative? Yes, I do. I am very comfortable in sort of saying, the very fact that I am representing my sister who is dead is an exploitation. And just own it and say that's the fact. She may not like the fact that, her picture is on the cover of this book. But I think you have to be very honest with yourself and say that as sort of your first position and then go from there. What bothers me about, all of that. I mean, you can have the fake interrogation rooms and, all of this at these crime con things. And, there's a lot of, for some of these people, laughing at the expense of the victims or even laughing at the expense of the offender, which I'm not really cool with either. I'm not cool with any of that. I think if you're serious about it, you shouldn't have to go there. There should be no need to go there. It's kind of cheap and gaudy. And if you have something to say, then say it. If you don't, then shut up.
Yeah, and you talk about you had some opportunities to be part of a true crime documentary, and you also put in I believe it was your blog, the bootlace killer.
Oh, it's absurd. You're right. That's kind of the apotheosis of it. I was getting no traction or attention for this problem of women murdered with similar MOs in Canada. So I wrote a piece called "Who is the Bootlace Killer?" Because Louise Cameron was found with a bootlace around her neck. That was it. But I knew I was pushing an edge with it, but it sort of came back to haunt me. There was some true crime guy in Quebec who then started talking about on the trail of the bootlace killer, as if this was a real phenomena in the 70s, and it wasn't. It was something I created to generate interest. It was absurd, and I suppose I didn't mind it because the point of it was to generate attention, but it got out of hand when people were asking me, can you tell me about the historical significance of the bootlace killer? And did the police believe in the bootlace killer? And it's like, no, man, I made this crap up. And I think your reaction, Roberta, is completely appropriate. It's ridiculous.
So, but we know with now I'm forgetting her name, the woman who oh my gosh, help me, who wrote this the Golden State Killer book. Now the dark I'll be gone. She came up with a name and she said that was the difference. I mean, I guess I don't know what my question is, but you also talked to a documentarian who wanted to connect your sister's murder with Maura Murray's murder. What do you think? Is it just a name? What is it about some true crime cases that capture the imagination? Is it the puzzle aspect that is it the unknown aspect that sometimes captures? But why is Maura Murray so popular and some other case isn't or is unknown? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, the Moira Murray case was from New Hampshire. I think it's 20 years old now. Was interesting. It's captivated everyone, and there's some people who have been very intrusive to the family about it, and I've talked more about Moira Murray more than any, only for the fact that it happened across the border in New Hampshire from where Theresa disappeared, and yes. At one point, Dateline NBC was very interested in doing a story on Theresa's case, but ultimately they gave me an ultimatum, and they said, "We'll only do it if you say you think it's connected to the Moira Murray case." And I said, "I'm not going to do that because I don't believe it." And they said, "Well, then there's no story." And it's that level of cynicism. That's where I draw the line. It's like, wait a minute. You can't be propagating lies about cases. That doesn't advance anything. But Moira Murray, I think there is the clue puzzle nature to it. It's easily digestible. Theresa's case is complicated and it's French. And Theresa's case is never going to be a Moira Murray case. But Moira's, she's a student on a campus. She gets into this car accident and she just disappears. And I think there's something about that does spark the imagination and gets people's engine running. I don't deny that there's cases that I get interested in and fascinated with. But I think at the end of the day, at 6 o'clock, you need to turn it off and you need to go for a swim or a walk or something and not make it all encompassing. Because, to be constantly like some of these people on Twitter and policing podcasters about what they should and should not be, entertaining as their subjects is absurd to me. It's just absurd.
What do you mean by that? Policing podcasters about their subjects?
Well, I see there's an awful lot of dialogue about, we should be giving voice to the Aboriginal cases or the gay cases or it's after George Floyd, everyone had a Black Lives Matter case, and I say, if you're compelled to do it, then do it. I've talked a lot about First Nations cases where I found it a compelling case. But don't do it. Don't be chasing ratings and because now this is, de rigueur to talk about Black Lives Matter and then start finger wagging at people who don't. I mean, this is just absurd to me.
Agreed. It's really virtue signaling is what it is.
It certainly is.
So you write in the acknowledgments of this book, to Theresa, we prevailed. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm an English major, and that's a bastardization of William Faulkner, and I think what Faulkner's actual words are to not only endure but to prevail, to stick with it. I think what I really mean is don't let the process defeat you. It's not going to defeat me. I sleep well at night. At 6 o'clock, I clock out, and my sister would kick my ass if I made this the sole purpose in my life. It's part of my life. I think the perception from my website and the book is that it's 100% of my life. It's not. It's not. So I think the idea to persevere is, despite the obstacles that the police and the school and people, even, there are family members who are not so hot that I do this. Rise above it. Go high. Go high.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to talk about related to your book? Wish you were here. Just kidding.
No, I appreciate you holding it up. I thank you for giving it a voice and having me on your program. The goal here is for people to read it. It really is, and if you think it stinks, contact me and we'll have a discussion about what you like about it or you don't. That's fine. But I'm a big believer in engagement and having discussions and if I come across as anti-police at some point, I'm not. We can discuss that. I'm far from it, but it may appear that I am. Anything is on the table as long as people have a dialogue about about something that I know about, which is criminal investigative failures and cold case event investigations.
I'm sorry, real quick. Now you sparked my interest. Did you get that reaction from your book? Because you're very critical of the Canadian police. You go into detail about cases where they really messed up. Did you get pushback from either police loyalists or the police themselves, or
certainly police and police loyalists? I get that. Hey, I go where a lot of people think that I chase cold cases looking for a unifying serial killer, which is not just because they put on the book The Hunt for a Serial Killer. Hey, that's Penguin Random House. They're going to do that. Do I entirely agree with it? But that's not what I've been doing. What I've really been looking at is, are there commonalities with my experience in other cases? And what I constantly run up against in Quebec are criminal investigative failures, where families were failed. And I'm not cherry picking, and I can cite you many cases in Quebec where the police got it absolutely right. And I've been very vocal about praising those instances. So I'm not, but if somebody feels that way, I'm very comfortable about having the discussion.
That's interesting. So I have a question for my audience. They're asking if you follow the Madeleine McCann case.
I don't know what that case is.
That's a case of a missing child in Portugal, went on vacation where their parents dined they left the children alone while they dined nearby, and they claim she was abducted. Other people have other theories, including myself. Anybody else have any questions before we wrap it up? Give a second. Okay, right. Is there anything else you want to plug? You also do a podcast.
Yeah, I do the podcast Who Killed Theresa. I have the website, which is just theresaallore.com, TheresaAllore.com. I've been very focused lately on a region in Quebec, but I'm about to finish that up in 2 weeks because I'm just about to sign the contract on a second book. The second book is not about Quebec.
Excellent.
It's an American case, so and that's
Great.
all I can say at this point. But it's an American case, and I feel privileged to get to write about it.
Well, you're always welcome to come back and talk about your book here. The link is in the description. John Allore, wish you were here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks.